I'd like you to think of a physical building and its structure, interior, exterior, and decorations. In a similar fashion, when it comes to websites and web apps, you can think of HTML as being the frame and structure. CSS, however, is the paint, wallpaper, fixtures, artwork, and overall style or look and feel. In other words, CSS tells the web browser how to display HTML elements on screen. When using CSS, there are 5 elements you need to understand. A declaration block starts with a left curly bracket and ends with the matching right curly bracket. In between these curly brackets are the style declarations. Let's cover these elements one by one. The first element of the CSS rule is the selector. This indicates which HTML element or elements you want to style. For example, you can create a rule that uses the H1 selector to change the color of all heading 1 tags in a web page to grey. In this case, H1 is the selector, color is property, and grey is the value of the property. You then create a declaration block using opening and closing curly brackets. The declaration block holds information about the properties and values that you are going to apply to the selector. Now let's focus on the structure of the declaration block. Each declaration is made up of 2 parts, a property and a value. For example, in this case, the properties that you want to change are the color and the background color of the header or selector. Once you have decided which properties you want to define, then you must assign each property a value. The color property gets a value of blue and the background color property gets a value of grey. This will result in all heading 1 tags displaying blue text on a grey background in the browser. By now, you'll have learned that CSS tells the web browser how to display HTML elements on screen. Now, let's work through an example to change a set of heading elements using different CSS rules. I will share a pro tip demonstrating how to install and use the VS Code extension Live Preview to speed up your workflow. Okay, so I'm back in Visual Studio Code here. Did you know that you can add additional functionality by using extensions? If you click on the Extensions tab, you can install the Live Preview extension by Microsoft. If you are running VS Code locally, you can install and use this extension. Once installed, right-click on your HTML file in the Explorer panel and select Live Preview, Show Preview. When you update an HTML file, you immediately notice the changes in Visual Studio Code. In this video, I will demonstrate how to create a CSS file and style some HTML elements. Before I start styling elements, let's create a simple HTML document named index.html. To demonstrate how CSS works, I will use an example created previously. Next, I create a file named style.css. For my web page to use the CSS file, I need to link it to the head element of the HTML file. To link to a style sheet, you use the link tag, which must be assigned 2 attributes, rel and href. The rel attribute is assigned to style sheet, and the href attribute is assigned to the name of the style sheet file. In this example, it's style.css. I am now ready to apply CSS to the index.html file, using style rules that I will write in the style.css file. The selector I am creating applies the CSS rule to all H1 elements. This type of selector is called an HTML type selector. The properties in the declaration block allow me to change how the selected elements are displayed. For example, I'm setting the color property of all the H1 elements to display text in purple. I save the file using Ctrl and S. Notice that this change occurs immediately and there is no need to refresh the web page. So now, what if I want to only style a single H1 element? I can add an ID attribute to the H1 tag that I want to style, and in my CSS file, I create a rule for that ID. Let's do that now. First, I create an ID rule using the hash symbol and then the name header1. Then I define the CSS properties of that rule to change the color value to green. I apply the rule and save the file using Ctrl and S. Notice that the text for the heading Chapter 1 on the web page turns green. You may be wondering, why does the first CSS rule not apply to the H1 element with the ID? This is because of something called CSS precedence and specificity. This is a complex statement, but basically, the browser will use the most precise selector for an HTML element. CSS has a set of hierarchy rules which dictate which rule will apply to an element. In this example, the ID rule takes precedence over the HTML type selector rule. You can learn more about CSS selector rules and precedence from the additional reading at the end of this lesson. Congratulations! You have now learned about the selection and styling in CSS. Let's quickly recap. After choosing a selector for your styles, you create a declaration block using opening and closing curly brackets. Inside of the code block, you write a declaration which consists of a property value, pair ending in a semicolon. And all these parts together, the selector, code block, and declaration make up a CSS rule. I encourage you to add some CSS rules to your HTML documents to practice selecting and styling.